We're going to take a deep dive into Claire's story.
Mhm.
You know, her run-in with Midnight Caller?
Mhm.
It's amazing how she managed to, like, weave these familiar horror elements into something new and terrifying.
Yeah.
I mean, we all love a good horror story, but what is it about this one? What makes it stick with you?
Well, I think what's so interesting is how it kind of starts.
Yeah.
You know, it kind of lulls you into this false sense of security
Right.
at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Claire's life in Clearwater is almost too perfect, peaceful, predictable, maybe even a little boring.
Yeah.
And then that just makes it so much more unsettling when things start to go wrong.
Right.
Like, you know, a flickering light
Yeah.
or, you know, a misplaced pen. It's subtle, but it's like the world is shifting just slightly,
Yeah.
creating this sense of unease.
Yeah, you get this creeping feeling that something is off, but you can't quite put your finger on it.
Exactly.
And then, bam, the creepy phone calls begin. Late night calls with nothing but breathing on the other end. I don't know about you, but
Oh,
that's like nightmare fuel.
it is. And it's such a classic trope, but it just works so well because it plays on that primal fear of the unknown.
Right,
We use phones to connect,
right.
to reach out to people. But in this case, it's a tool for something very sinister to invade her space, her personal space.
Right.
And then you add that detail that the number is untraceable.
Oh, yeah.
Imagine that helplessness. The feeling of being trapped. She
Yeah.
can't block the number.
What?
She can't call for help. She's completely at the mercy of this unknown caller.
Right.
And I think this resonates even more strongly today because of our dependence on technology.
Oh, yeah.
We think we're in control, but stories like this remind us that we're not always as safe and secure as we think.
Absolutely right. It's like this modern twist on the classic fear of the unknown. And the figure at the window, oh man, that image is pure nightmare material.
Yeah.
You know, the story is definitely playing on our deepest fears,
Mhm.
like the fear of something lurking in the shadows watching us,
Oh, yeah.
you know?
Absolutely. And the figure is so deliberately described, you know, tall, thin, with these unnatural movements, a blurred face, all designed to make it feel inhuman, otherworldly. You know, humans are wired to fear the things that defy our understanding of the world.
Right.
And this figure definitely does that.
Absolutely.
Checks those boxes.
Yeah.
But it goes beyond just the appearance.
Right.
You know, the way the figure escalates its presence. First in the woods,
Right.
and then at the window,
Uh-huh.
and then finally inside the house.
Oh my gosh.
It's brilliant the way the author builds that terror.
Yeah.
Each step is a violation of Claire's boundaries, making the threat feel immediate and inescapable.
Yeah, you can really feel the story like closing in on her,
Yeah.
suffocating her with fear. And that moment when the figure actually gets inside the house,
Ooh.
chills. Absolute chills. And you know what really struck me? The caller's words. What do you want from me? Fear. It's almost as if fear itself is the real monster here.
Yeah, I think you're right. You hit the nail on the head there. Unlike so many horror stories that focus on a physical monster, this one turns the concept on its head.
Right.
The caller. It feeds off of Claire's fear. It's almost like a parasitic relationship where her terror fuels its power.
Which makes her eventual defiance even more powerful.
Yes.
When Claire finally confronts the caller and says, "I'm not afraid of you," it's a turning point in the story.
Absolutely.
It's like she cuts off the source of his power.
Yes.
You know, it's a really empowering moment for Claire and honestly for the reader as well.
It is, and it's a good reminder for us as well. You know, we all have fears,
Oh, yeah.
anxieties, things that seem overwhelming. But Claire's story demonstrates that facing our fears head on, as terrifying as it may be, can be the key to overcoming them. It's about reclaiming our power, our sense of agency.
Absolutely. Now, about that ending, the caller is gone. But is it defeated? What does that say about what Claire faces going forward? You know, in horror, the monster rarely stays dead.
That's true. It's classic horror.
Yeah.
The ending is intentionally ambiguous. It leaves us with that lingering sense of unease, the feeling that something sinister is still out there waiting for the right moment to strike again.
Especially with that final text message. Miss me.
Oh, yeah.
Chilling.
Chilling.
It reminds us that true horror isn't just about jump scares or gore. You know, It's about the psychological impact.
Right.
The way fear can stay with you long after the story is over.
Mm-hmm.
It gets under your skin and stays there.
And what's so fascinating is how it leaves so much open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Did Claire actually defeat the caller?
Yeah.
Or is it just biding its time? And what about that carved wooden figure that she found? Was that some sort of conduit for the caller to manifest? The story doesn't offer any easy answers.
Right.
And that's what makes it all the more unsettling.
Right.
It forces us to confront our own anxieties and fears.
Yeah.
Imagine what might be lurking in the shadows.
I love how you said that. It doesn't spoon feed you. It makes you think. It makes you imagine those worst case scenarios.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's what makes it so effective.
Yeah, and what's especially interesting is how it plays on a very primal fear, the fear of the unseen.
Wow.
As humans,
Mhm.
we're hardwired to fear what we can't see
Yeah.
or understand. It's that uncertainty, that sense of vulnerability that just makes this story so effective.
Yeah, it's like tapping into this collective nightmare,
Yes.
right? The idea that something is out there watching us, waiting for its moment. It's a fear that's as old as humanity itself.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
And the story just brilliantly uses that fear
Yeah.
to create this sense of dread that just pervades every page. You're constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop,
Right.
waiting for that next terrifying revelation.
Yeah.
It's a masterclass in suspense.
So we've talked about the creepy phone calls,
Mm-hmm.
the lurking figure,
Right.
the unsettling ending.
Yeah.
But there's another layer to this story that I think is really important, and that's the psychological impact of the caller's presence
Oh, absolutely.
on Claire.
The caller doesn't just terrorize her physically.
Right.
It also invades her mind,
Mhm.
her sense of self.
Yeah.
It's like this slow, insidious process,
Right.
like a poison seeping into her psyche. And that's what makes it so terrifying.
Right.
It's not just about the external threat, but the internal struggle as well.
Oh, absolutely. And you can see that in the way she starts to doubt herself,
Mm-hmm.
her sanity.
Yeah.
She questions her own perception of reality, wonders if she's imagining things.
Yeah.
She's going crazy.
Right.
And it's classic gaslighting.
It is.
And it's used to devastating effect in the story.
Absolutely. The caller preys on her vulnerability.
Right.
Her isolation whispers these doubts in her ear,
Right.
making her question everything she believes.
Yeah.
It's a brilliant way to heighten the tension
Right.
and make the reader feel that growing sense of panic.
And it speaks to a larger truth about horror,
Mm-hmm.
I think. The scariest monsters aren't always the ones with the fangs and claws.
Right.
Sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that live inside our heads,
Yeah.
the ones that feed on our doubts and our fears.
That's a brilliant insight. I love that.
Oh, thank you.
The caller is almost like a manifestation of her deepest anxieties,
Right.
her darkest fears. And by confronting the caller, she's ultimately confronting those fears within herself.
Right. It's like this psychological battle
Yes.
where the stakes are not just her physical safety, but her very sanity.
Exactly. And that's what makes the story so compelling.
Right.
It's not just a surface level horror story.
Yeah.
It's a deep dive into the human psyche, into the dark recesses of our minds where fear and anxiety reside. It's like, it really mirrors real life anxieties.
Oh, yeah.
We might not have a midnight caller,
Right.
but we all have those personal monsters, those fears
Yeah.
that whisper in the dark corners of our minds.
No, absolutely. The story takes those universal feelings of being watched or dread in the face of a late night phone call and
Yes.
just cranks them up to 11.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, yeah.
And remember how she initially tries to rationalize it?
Oh, yeah.
She blames it on faulty wiring or her imagination
Yeah.
or internet pranks.
Right.
It's so human,
Yeah.
to try and explain away the unexplainable, to fit it into our existing framework of understanding.
And it's just so much more frightening when those explanations fail.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? You're just left with this growing sense of dread,
Yes.
knowing that something is wrong,
Mm.
but you can't quite grasp what it is.
It's that creeping uncertainty that just burrows under your skin.
I know.
And the story brilliantly highlights how isolating that can be.
Oh, yeah.
You remember how her friends and even her dad, at first they just kind of brush off her concerns.
Mm-hmm.
They try to explain it away, reassure her that it's nothing,
Yeah.
but it just makes her feel more alone.
It's well-intentioned, but it ultimately isolates her.
Right, no one believes her.
Exactly.
No one understands what she's going through.
It's that classic horror trope, you know?
Right.
The protagonist is the lone witness,
Mhm.
the one who sees the truth that everyone else is blind to.
Yeah.
And that isolation just amplifies the fear
Yeah.
because she's facing this unknown without any support
Yeah.
or validation.
It's like the story's asking us, what if you were in Claire's shoes?
Yeah.
Who would you turn to?
Right.
Who would believe you?
Exactly.
And that thought alone is terrifying.
And it makes her decision to confront the caller all the more powerful.
Right.
Because she realizes that no one else can save her.
Mm-hmm.
She has to face this fear head on. Let's talk about Mrs. Green,
Okay.
the medium.
Yes.
Her role is so fascinating.
It is.
She seems to represent this idea that sometimes even our traditional ways of understanding the world, religion, logic, science,
Right.
they can't explain the truly strange or terrifying.
That's a great point.
Right, yeah.
Mrs. Green introduces this element of the supernatural,
Right.
These forces that are beyond our comprehension. And even she, with her expertise in the spirit world,
Right.
she can't fully grasp the caller's nature
Right.
or its grip on Claire.
And her warning to Claire, you'll have to confront it yourself, is both terrifying and empowering.
It is.
It acknowledges that sometimes we have to face our demons alone. There's no magic solution.
And it reinforces that there's no easy answer,
Right.
no spell to banish fear. It's about finding that inner strength to
Ah.
stand up to the darkness, even when it feels impossible.
Which resonates with all of us.
Absolutely. Right? We might not face literal monsters,
Yeah.
but we all have those metaphorical demons to confront. Fears, anxieties, challenges. We can't just wish away.
Right.
Sometimes you have to stare them down and say, I'm not afraid of you anymore.
Exactly. And good horror offers that kind of empowerment. It lets us explore those dark, uncomfortable emotions
Right.
in a safe space.
Yeah.
Confront fears vicariously through the characters.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, it gives us the courage to face our own demons in the real world.
I love that.
Yeah.
It's like horror can be a rehearsal for real life, a way to practice facing our fears and finding our inner strength.
And it reminds us that even in the darkest times,
Yeah.
even when we feel utterly alone, there's always a spark of hope.
Right.
Claire's story is terrifying,
Yeah.
but it's ultimately about resilience, about finding the courage to face the unknown
Yeah.
and emerge stronger. Okay, so we've discussed the psychological depth of the story, the way it uses horror tropes to tap into our deepest fears.
Right.
Let's talk about the writing itself.
Okay.
The author creates a truly immersive
Yes.
and terrifying experience.
Absolutely.
For example, the way the author uses sensory details to pull you into the story
Yeah.
is just masterful.
Oh, the language is so vivid and evocative.
Right.
It's almost like you're right there with Claire, feeling the chill in the air, hearing the whispers in the darkness.
And the author doesn't shy away from the gruesome details either.
No, they don't.
Like that description of the caller's face
No.
when Claire finally sees it clearly.
Yeah.
Pale, gaunt, those sunken eyes, nightmare fuel.
It is.
And the way the story builds tension, using those short, choppy sentences
Yes.
to create this sense of urgency and panic.
Right.
Masterful.
It's like you're holding your breath right along with Claire,
right.
waiting for that next terrifying reveal.
And the use of sound is so effective.
Oh, yes.
The constant buzzing of the phone, the scratching at the window, those whispering voices.
Yeah, it creates this auditory assault that just gets under your skin and stays there.
And let's not forget the silence.
Oh,
The way the story uses silence to amplify the tension,
Right?
to make you lean in and listen for that next sign of danger.
Exactly.
Brilliant.
It's like the silence itself becomes a character. This presence that's both unsettling
Right.
and expectant.
Yeah.
It's in those moments of quiet
Right.
that your imagination just runs wild,
Yeah.
filling in the blanks with your own personal fears.
Speaking of filling in the blanks, this story doesn't give you all the answers, does it?
No, it doesn't.
It leaves you with a lot of questions, a lot of room for your own imagination to run wild. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so effective.
Absolutely. The story's ambiguity is one of its greatest strengths. It doesn't try to explain everything.
Yeah.
It doesn't tie up all the loose ends.
Right.
It leaves you with that sense of unease, that feeling that something is still out there lurking just beyond our understanding. And that, I think, is the essence of true horror.
Right.
You know, it's not about the jump scares or the gore. It's about that lingering sense of dread,
Yeah.
that feeling that something is wrong,
Right.
even when you can't quite put your finger on it.
I think that's why this story is so effective at getting under our skin.
Yeah.
You know, it taps into that primal fear of the unknown, the fear of what we can't see or understand.
Right.
And it does it in a way that feels both familiar and fresh.
You know, one of the things I find most fascinating about horror
Yeah.
is its ability to reflect our societal anxieties.
Oh, interesting.
You know, the monsters and threats we see in these stories, they often mirror the fears and anxieties we experience in our own lives.
That's a great point. It's like horror is a way for us to process our fears, to confront them in a safe space.
Right.
And by doing so, we can gain a better understanding of them
Exactly.
and maybe even find ways to overcome them.
And I think The Midnight Caller does a brilliant job of reflecting some of our most pressing contemporary anxieties.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
You know, the fear of isolation, the feeling of being watched,
Right.
the sense that we're losing control over our own lives.
Right.
These are all themes that resonate deeply in today's world.
It's interesting that you mentioned the theme of isolation
Yeah,
because it plays such a crucial role in this story.
it does.
You know, Claire is physically isolated in her remote home,
Right.
but she's also emotionally isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Her friends and family don't believe her.
Right.
They dismiss her concerns.
Yeah,
And that just serves to amplify her fear and vulnerability.
absolutely. And I think that sense of isolation is something that many people can relate to,
Oh, for sure.
especially in our increasingly digital age.
Yeah.
You know, we're constantly connected online, but sometimes that can lead to a sense of disconnection in the real world.
Right. We can feel lost in a crowd, surrounded by people, but still utterly alone.
Exactly.
And that's where horror can step in. Right? It can provide a sense of community, a shared experience of fear and catharsis.
Precisely when we watch or read a horror story,
Right.
we're entering into this shared space with other people who understand and appreciate those feelings of fear and dread.
Right.
We're no longer alone in our anxieties.
So in a way, horror can be a powerful tool for connection and empathy,
It can.
even though it deals with some of our darkest fears and emotions.
Exactly. It's a paradox.
Mm-hmm.
But it's what makes horror so fascinating and enduring.
So thinking about how this story reflects our contemporary anxieties, what do you think the caller represents?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I think it's open to interpretation.
Okay.
You know, on one level, the caller can be seen as a manifestation of those unseen forces that we feel are encroaching on our lives.
Right.
You know, the forces of chaos and uncertainty
Yeah.
that threaten to disrupt our sense of order and security.
Right.
But on another level, I think the caller can also be seen as a representation of our own inner demons.
Oh, wow.
You know, those dark thoughts and impulses that we try to suppress,
Right.
but that always seem to be lurking just beneath the surface.
That's a fascinating idea.
Yeah.
It's like the caller is both an external threat and an internal struggle.
Yes.
And by confronting the caller, Claire is ultimately confronting those dark aspects of herself.
Exactly. And that's what makes the story so powerful.
Right.
It's not just a surface level horror story. It's a deep dive into the human psyche,
Yeah.
into the dark recesses of our minds where fear and anxiety reside.
You know, it's interesting how The Midnight Caller takes these classic horror tropes, like the creepy phone calls,
Yeah.
the lurking figure, the isolated protagonist, and gives them like this depth, this complexity.
Yeah. It really elevates it beyond just a typical horror flick.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just about that external threat,
Right.
the monster in the shadows.
Yeah.
It's about that internal struggle,
True.
the way that fear can distort our perception and chip away at our sense of self.
It's a story that messes with your head.
Yeah.
You start off thinking, okay, this is a straightforward stalker story.
Right.
And then bam, it just veers into this supernatural territory. It blurs the lines between reality and nightmare, and you're constantly questioning, like,
Right.
what's real, what's not.
And that uncertainty is terrifying.
Right.
That feeling of being unmoored from reality.
Okay, let's talk about that ending.
Okay.
Claire confronts. The caller seems to banish it. But there's this lingering sense of unease.
Yes.
You know, that final text message, miss me.
Right.
It's not a goodbye.
Oh,
It's like a threat.
it is.
A promise that the horror isn't truly over.
The author could have so easily just gone for a typical horror ending. You know, monster defeated,
Yeah.
but they chose something much more unsettling.
Right.
That ambiguity is what makes it so effective.
Right.
The threat remains.
Yeah.
It's lurking just beyond our perception.
Mm.
And that is so much more terrifying than any definitive resolution.
It's like the story acknowledges that, trauma, fear, these things don't just vanish overnight.
Nope.
They linger
It
in the
is.
shadows of our minds,
Yeah,
just waiting for the right moment to resurface.
exactly. The ending reminds us that some wounds run deep,
Yeah.
and that psychological impact can be just as debilitating as any physical threat.
Right.
She might have survived this encounter, but will she ever truly be free
Right.
from the caller's influence?
Right.
It's a question that lingers long after the story ends.
So how do you think Claire's experience will shape her going forward? Will she ever truly feel safe again?
That's the question that the story intentionally leaves open.
Right.
On the one hand, she has shown incredible strength.
Mm.
She confronted her fear head on.
Right.
She stood up to the caller,
Yeah.
and she lived to tell the tale.
But on the other hand, the trauma that she's endured is immense. I mean, she's seen and experienced things beyond comprehension.
Absolutely.
Things that would shake anyone to their core. And that kind of trauma, it leaves scars,
It does.
doesn't it?
It does, even with that immediate threat gone,
Yeah.
She will likely carry the weight of that experience with her.
Right.
It may affect her relationships, her outlook on life, her very sense of self.
Right.
It's a battle she'll continue to fight long after that final page.
This story really suggests that surviving a traumatic event is just the first step.
Yeah.
The real challenge lies in healing, in learning to live with the scars,
Right.
and finding a way to move forward without letting fear control your life.
Absolutely, and I think that's what makes her story so inspiring. Because she shows us that even in the face of unimaginable terror, we can find the strength to overcome our fears and emerge from that experience stronger than ever before.
As we wrap up our deep dive into Claire's encounter with the Midnight Caller, I'm left with this question. What unseen forces might be feeding on our anxieties in the real world?
It's a question worth considering,
Yeah.
While the caller may be a fictional creation, the fears that it embodies are all too real.
Right.
And perhaps by exploring these fears through the lens of horror, we can better understand them, confront them, and ultimately find ways to overcome them.
Yeah, it's like shining a light on the darkness,
Exactly.
exposing it for what it is, and in doing so, diminishing its power.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
I think so too. We've explored the depths of the Midnight Caller, unpacked its chilling brilliance, and maybe even learned a thing or two about ourselves along the way.
We have.
It's a reminder that even in the face of terror, even when we feel completely alone, there's always a spark of light within us. A spark that can guide us through the darkness and help us find our way back to ourselves.
I love that.
And sometimes the best way to face those fears is to share them,
Yes.
to talk about them, to find solace in the knowledge that we're not alone in our anxieties.
That's the beauty of stories like this.
Yeah.
They remind us that even in our darkest moments, we're never truly alone.
Right.
There's always someone out there somewhere
Yeah.
who understands, who's been there, who can offer a hand to pull us back from the abyss.
Yeah. And that's a powerful message of hope.
It is.